For years, whenever someone asked a simple question like, which Linux distro should I start with? The most common answer across forums, YouTube comments, tech blogs, and even experienced users was almost automatic. Use Ubuntu. It became the default recommendation, the safe choice, the beginner distro. But here's the uncomfortable truth that many people in the Linux community are starting to realize. We need to stop recommending Ubuntu to beginners by default, not because Ubuntu is terrible, not because it doesn't work, and not because millions of people don't still use it. The real reason is that the Linux ecosystem has evolved. Beginners have different expectations today, and Ubuntu is no longer the easiest or most beginner-friendly option in many situations. To understand why Ubuntu became the beginner recommendation in the first place, we need to go back about 15 or 20 years. At that time, Linux was far less polished than it is today. Installing drivers was complicated, desktop environments were inconsistent, and documentation was scattered. Ubuntu came in and solved many of those problems. It had a simple installer, decent hardware detection, large community forums, and most importantly, a massive user base. If you searched for help online, chances were high that someone had already solved your exact problem on Ubuntu. That reliability and accessibility made it the logical suggestion for new users who were leaving Windows or macOS and stepping into the Linux world for the first time. But the landscape has changed dramatically. Today, there are dozens of Linux distributions that are just as easy to install, often easier to use, and in many cases more polished out of the box than Ubuntu. Yet the recommendation culture hasn't caught up with that reality. Many people still reflexively say install Ubuntu without considering whether it's actually the best choice for a beginner in 2026. This habit doesn't necessarily help newcomers. In some cases, it actually makes their first Linux experience more confusing or frustrating than it needs to be. One of the biggest reasons Ubuntu isn't always ideal for beginners anymore is its design philosophy. Over the past several years, Ubuntu has increasingly focused on snap packages as its primary software distribution method. On paper, snap packages are supposed to solve dependency issues and provide sandboxing for better security. But for many users, especially beginners, the experience can feel slow and confusing. Applications installed as snap packages often launch slower than their traditional counterparts, sometimes take longer to update, and occasionally behave differently from versions available through other package managers. A new user who just switched from Windows expects applications to open quickly and behave predictably. When their browser takes noticeably longer to launch, or when software installs in unfamiliar ways, it creates friction that didn't need to exist. Another issue is that Ubuntu has gradually moved away from being the lightweight, flexible system it once was. Modern Ubuntu releases are heavier than many alternatives. It might not matter on a powerful modern computer. But many beginners trying Linux are doing so because they want to revive an older laptop or desktop that struggles with Windows. In those situations, Ubuntu can feel sluggish compared to alternatives like Linux Mint, Ubuntu, or lightweight distributions specifically designed for older hardware. If a beginner installs Ubuntu on an aging system and the experience feels slow, they might wrongly assume that Linux itself is the problem, when in reality, they simply chose the wrong distribution for their hardware. Then there's the desktop environment. Ubuntu uses a customized version of GNOME, which is visually modern, but not always intuitive for people coming from Windows. The workflow is different. The application launcher behaves differently. Window management works differently. None of these things are inherently bad, but they create a learning curve that beginners don't necessarily need. For someone switching from Windows, a desktop environment like Cinnamon, which is used by Linux Mint, feels far more familiar. It has a traditional taskbar, a start menu style launcher, and predictable navigation. When beginners see something that resembles what they already know, the transition becomes smoother and less intimidating. Another factor people often overlook is community support quality. Yes, Ubuntu has one of the largest communities in the Linux world. But that doesn't automatically mean it's the most helpful for beginners today. Because Ubuntu has such a massive user base, discussions online can be messy, outdated, or contradictory. Beginners frequently run into guides written for older versions of Ubuntu that no longer apply to modern releases. They may find instructions that rely on deprecated commands or outdated package names. This leads to confusion and sometimes broken systems. Meanwhile, some newer distributions maintain clearer documentation and more focused communities, specifically aimed at helping new Linux users. There's also the issue of branding and expectations. Ubuntu is often marketed as a universal solution for everything from desktops to servers to cloud infrastructure. While that versatility is impressive, it also means the distribution is trying to serve many different audiences at once. Beginners may end up dealing with design decisions influenced by enterprise or cloud priorities rather than desktop usability. In contrast, some distributions focus almost entirely on the desktop experience, optimizing every aspect for daily personal computing rather than enterprise integration. Another subtle but important reason to reconsider recommending Ubuntu is that the Linux ecosystem thrives on diversity. When everyone recommends the same distribution by default, it limits exploration and discourages innovation. New users might never discover distributions that better suit their needs, simply because the community keeps pointing them toward the same familiar option. Encouraging beginners to explore alternatives like Linux Mint, Fedora Workstation, or Pop_OS can lead to better matches between users and systems. These distributions often provide cleaner interfaces, faster updates, or better hardware compatibility depending on the situation. Take Linux Mint as an example. It's built on top of Ubuntu but removes many of the design decisions that frustrate beginners. It replaces snap packages with traditional package management, provides a familiar desktop environment, and includes useful tools for system management. Many people who struggle with Ubuntu find Mint immediately comfortable. That alone raises an important question. If Mint often provides a smoother experience for new users, why do we keep recommending Ubuntu instead? Or consider Pop_OS, developed by System76. It focuses heavily on usability, productivity, and hardware compatibility, particularly for laptops and systems with dedicated GPUs. The developers invest significant effort into polishing the user experience, making installation straightforward, and minimizing the need for manual configuration. Beginners who install Pop_OS often find that everything works out of the box with minimal tweaking. Fedora Workstation is another strong contender. While it once had a reputation for being more advanced, modern Fedora releases are extremely polished and reliable. Software is up to date, security practices are strong, and the system integrates modern Linux technologies earlier than many other distributions. For users who want a stable but cutting-edge desktop environment, Fedora can actually provide a better introduction to modern Linux than Ubuntu. What this really comes down to is a shift in mindset within the Linux community. Instead of automatically recommending Ubuntu, experienced users should start asking beginners a few simple questions. What hardware are you using? You're coming from Windows or macOS? Do you want something lightweight or visually polished? You comfortable learning new workflows, or do you prefer something familiar? Once those questions are answered, it becomes much easier to recommend a distribution that actually fits the person, rather than defaulting to a single option. It's also important to emphasize that saying "stop recommending Ubuntu to beginners" doesn't mean Ubuntu is a bad distribution. It's still powerful, stable, and widely used. Many developers, system administrators, and professionals rely on it every day. Ubuntu plays a huge role in the Linux ecosystem, especially in servers and cloud environments. The point is simply that being popular or historically beginner-friendly doesn't automatically make it the best starting point for every new user today. The Linux community often prides itself on choice, flexibility, and user freedom. But if our recommendations don't reflect those values, we're not really practicing what we preach. Beginners deserve thoughtful suggestions tailored to their needs, not automatic answers based on habits formed years ago. If someone is installing Linux on an old laptop, maybe they should try a lightweight distribution first. If they want something that feels familiar coming from Windows, a Cinnamon-based desktop might be ideal. If they're interested in cutting-edge Linux technologies, Fedora could be the better option. And if Ubuntu genuinely fits their needs, then by all means recommend it. The key difference is making Ubuntu one option among many, rather than presenting it as the universal default. Ultimately, the goal should always be the same: give beginners the best possible first experience with Linux. A positive first impression can turn someone into a lifelong Linux user. A frustrating one might push them away permanently. By broadening our recommendations and thinking more carefully about each user's situation, we can help more people discover what makes Linux great in the first place. So the next time someone asks which Linux distribution they should start with, pause before giving the automatic answer. Ask a few questions. Consider their hardware, their expectations, and their level of experience. Ubuntu might still be the right choice sometimes, but it shouldn't be the only answer anymore.